My name is Colleen Griffiths, and I am president and owner of Undiscovered Radio Network. I got my start many years ago in broadcasting for Clear Channel Communications. I left the evil empire in 2002. I did a lot of work in marketing and programming, and went back to school, got my master's degree, and started teaching. And during that whole process of doing all the research, came up with the idea for the company that I now run and operate. Undiscovered Radio Network is actually a company that produces independent programs that air on affiliate stations, and they're all commercial broadcast stations across the nation. So what we do is we solicit music from independent record labels and independent musicians, and then we piece together in our studios 2-hour shows that air weekly on any FM station that we can get to carry our show in the United States. The business model is based on that we don't take any money from the artists. We get our funding from advertising. Once we produce the shows, then we try to convince radio stations to pick it up, and it's picked up on a barter basis. So within the 2-hour show that we produce, we ask for 5 minutes per hour in commercial time that we can then resell to advertising. So right now we actually get national advertising within our program, and that's where we get all of our funding. I'm like a professional networking person. I love to meet people and hear about their ideas and how they got into business, and then kind of come up with my own ideas and apply their ways of thinking to my own. So I really got into it because I was helping a friend run an indie label out in Los Angeles. He used to be in a band that was signed to a major label, and Kevin was the lead singer of the band Candlebox, which was fairly popular. And through helping him run his indie label, I realized that there's really no access for independent artists to get onto mainstream radio. So I started researching how to get indie artists on radio without basically losing money, how to actually build a business model that could provide the access and make money. And I came up with syndication as the best way because it's self-contained. Program directors are not opposed to playing indie artists because we help market the show, and it's a nice, neat little 2-hour package, so it's not interfering with the rest of their weekly programming, which is where they make their bread and butter. So we're stuck usually on Sunday nights at midnight or wherever. But we make enough money because we can get lots of stations to carry our show rather than just one station. I built this business model based on a 5-year long-term goal because I know that being independent, you don't get anything like that. And I was very fortunate to have an entrepreneurial aunt that was basically got me a loan and got me the funding to get it up and running, and it took off. All the research I'd done, literally everything led to even greater basically success than I thought we'd have. So make sure that you do your research. A lot of businesses fail because they don't look at things outside their thought. They don't look at other business models in other areas. I looked at commercial television and how it ran and how syndication ran in that industry. I looked at marketing for automotive dealers, and I looked at different ways that people got their product sold and how they marketed it and how they actually remained viable. I also looked at basically how long it would take. A lot of people that get into a new business venture, their expectations are so grossly out of proportion. I know that I'm not going to really start making profit for probably 4 years. So I set up, the loan and the operational expenses, my marketing budget, everything based on how much money I could borrow, how the money was going to come in, and I set up a long-term plan so that, after 2 years, I'm not going to go belly up. I'm set and settled so that, if we do have, we take off and have a lot of success, then that's great. But if we don't, we're stable enough that we will maintain. So very methodical, very organized. So just make sure you do all our research and you get everything organized and you look to the future. Incredibly important, and it's kind of like I told you before, I studied broadcast television and cable television, how everybody in the 1980s said, oh, the broadcast stations are going to go under now that we have this great, 500 channel cable system. That's not true. Mass audience still goes to broadcast television first. Same thing with broadcast radio. All the research done by all the independent research companies all still show that younger audience go to broadcast radio for new music discovery above all other forms of media. What they don't do any longer is they don't spend a lot of time with it, because what they do is they go to broadcast radio, they hear new artists, and then they follow up with the internet. They'll download into their iPods, and then they'll listen to the artists, but they continue to go back to broadcast radio for that discovery process, which is something that makes what we do very successful, because we market that we have a 2-hour block of time that's nothing but new music. And then when we reach out to our consumer base, the listeners, we let them know what time that we air and when they can tune in for this new music. And it creates appointment listening, which is a trend that's in television. Well, it's now starting to show up in radio. Time spent listening is starting to decline, but the audience is not shrinking. It's still there. It just doesn't spend as much time with it as it did. So radio has to kind of use, the broadcast airwaves in a new form, and they have to incorporate, other media platforms such as the internet and the websites to kind of follow up and keep the listener and the audience and the consumer for a longer period of time. Online radio, I think it's a great thing, but it creates a problem because there's a lot of online radio stations out there, and it creates clutter in the market. There's no focus, and just like any other business, if you have 500 restaurants that are mediocre and one really great restaurant, it kind of takes away from what could be, rather than, sometimes you want quality, not quantity. Unfortunately, with a lot of online stations, because it's so easy to do, what you get is a lot of quantity and low quality, and that affects the overall, product itself, the entire product. So we like online radio, but we don't venture into it because of that. What I'd like to see happen is for, the major players to start to take over and some of the smaller online shows to go away, so that the mass audience, those numbers can come back. Because again, most business models are based on numbers, people numbers. And so if you've got all of those people divided amongst 100,000 stations rather than 100 really good ones, then they're not going to stay viable, and they're all just going to pop up and go away very quickly. It's the same thing that's going to happen. It's just dividing the pie. There are only so many people that listen to music in a certain area. Satellite radio, it's great because you can have stations with no commercial interruption. But what happens, just the satellite stations that are in existence today, they can't make enough money. The business models cannot make enough money because they've divided the pie. And again, they divided it so that nobody can remain viable. Where if there's a really strong or several strong leaders in the industry, then the mass can be divided so that they can still get enough revenue from that to remain viable. HD radio is the most horrible thing that can happen to broadcast radio, because it's like cable and television. And what's going to happen is several different issues are going to take place. First of all, the amount of money the radio stations have to sink into the technology to have HD signals. That's a lot of money. Radio stations barely make it because they don't have as much advertising revenue coming in as they did. So then they've got to sink more money into this HD technology that is going to just divide the audience again. So a company that's in a market that has 4 stations is now going to have the possibility of having 2 to 10 additional HD stations. Where are they going to get the money to provide content for all those stations? Are they going to hire all new jocks to run those stations? They've got not only the technology, but you've got, content, talent. You've got a lot going into it. And there's no real true value when you've only got 100,000 listeners in a market, and suddenly you go from 2 stations to 10. You still only have 100,000 people out there, to get to listen to your station and to sell that to the advertising agencies. So what are you going to do when your pie is suddenly cut into 50 pieces instead of 5? it's going to create a lot of chaos. They're going to get less and less revenue coming from it because advertisers are going to get frustrated. They're going to look for mass audience other places because they don't want to deal with all of that clutter and this, all the people being in different places. It becomes very difficult to generate revenue that way. And the same thing with cable television. You turn on TNT today, and they say, oh, it's going to really affect broadcast stations. Well, what's the content on TNT? It's what you find on the major networks, because a lot of the smaller networks can't provide, they don't have enough funding to produce unique programming all day long. It's an expensive process. So you really have a problem where the HD stations, where are they going to get new programs? Where are they going to get all of this new music? There's only so much out there, and it takes people and time and money to put it all together so that it's quality. Again, quality versus quantity. It's a double-edged sword. You've got niche, but a lot of the research show that the niche broadcasting, it's great at first, but if you look at long-term trends, what happens is, for example, you hear a lot of the research on broadcast stations, like, where rock got very niched into certain genres of just rock music. What happens is listeners start having content fatigue. Instead of having, a lot of content in that niche, they end up repeating artists and songs over and over and over. So it's kind of a dangerous thing. It's great that it's niched. And again, my company, we rely on that. Our niche is that we only play independent and unsigned artists. So it's all new, it's all unheard of. So we rely on the niche, in that formula. But again, to get too niched, if we, like local programs on radio stations where they only play local artists, the first 6 months, the trend is the first 6 months to a year, the show is huge in the market. They have lots of support, there's lots of goodwill. Then after that, they run out of new bands to play. It's like the same people over and over and over. There's an occasional new, artist or a new band that crops in, but listeners start to fade, the consumer starts to go away because they get tired of hearing the same thing over and over. So it's kind of like a dangerous thing where you have the good where you're providing the niche, something that people really like, so you get that target, that very specific audience, consumer. But then again, you get the fatigue because they get tired of, it gets stale very quickly. I recommend that indie artists don't focus on radio play. It's really a futile effort because they don't have the time or the energy to put into it. Major record labels, that's why they have so much control. They have, promotions departments, they have people, the communication line set up so that, they have people that call the program directors every week to shop the records, to work it. Indie musicians, they cannot afford to do that. They don't have the time to do that. They need to focus on their creativity. It's very important for them to use the resources that they do have and pick kind of like a strategy to, if they want to start in a particular area, like a region, then they can work radio in that area, especially if they're touring, but don't try to the shotgun blast approach, spill it out there and see what comes back. It doesn't work, and it's a lot of times a waste of effort when they could be putting their time and their money and their energy in a more productive way of marketing themselves. We are basically that communication line for them. We've opened the doorway, so all they have to do is send a CD to us. They don't have to constantly work the record. They don't have to convince us to play them because we really make it our mission to listen to the indie artists, to listen to all the music that's submitted to us. And if it's quality music, we like what they're doing, they have some value, then we play them. We give them some, spins on the radio waves. And we are the people that are constantly calling those program directors to get our show picked up. So if our show's picked up, then that just helps the indie artists because they'll get the radio play through our platform. A lot of my research that I did showed that a lot of the complaints with younger audiences with broadcast radio You heard phrases like, I hate to tune in and, the song plays and I love it, it's a new artist, and the only thing I hear about is the the Kmart Blue Light Special or what's happening at Walmart. They don't talk about the artist, they don't talk about the songs. The DJs sound like they're there just to get their paychecks, not to, because they're enthusiastic about the music. And, a lot of different phrases like that came through in a lot of the qualitative research that I did. And what really started to appear is this picture of what younger audiences wanted. They wanted what radio used to be, where you had DJs that, listened to all the albums, cover to cover, and they really got to know the artist. And when they came on the air, they talked about, the song and told you a little bit about the artist or what you just heard. That rarely happens anymore on commercial broadcast stations. So we made it a focus. You don't hear us talking about anything in between songs other than the artist. We always tell you who the artist was, what the album's called, the song title, and where you can go to find out more information about that artist. Because that's what really the younger audience were looking for is they love the song and they wanted to follow up. They need that information, that channel, so that they can go explore on their own. That's what they said in 1980 would happen to broadcast television. Terrestrial radio will never die. It's free, it's mobile, and again, you're not going to find a medium like that has a lot of the strengths and value that it does. Do I think that it will have to change and morph and adapt to new technology and new ways of doing business? Yes, just like every other business. But I don't think it will ever go away. You still have a large portion of the United States that, broadcast radio is free to everyone, and almost everyone has an FM radio somewhere. All the cars still have FM radios. Even the MP3 players and the new technology that came out, all of a sudden a few years after the new technology is introduced, they start incorporating FM tuners in them. So, my argument is that if that's the case, then why are they looking back and saying, oh, well, we need to also address, terrestrial broadcast radio, because it's still a very popular medium. I see the future of broadcast radio. I think it's changing for the better. I was very frustrated when I left the broadcast industry in 2002 with the state of things, and I see that the people that truly are in it because they love the product and they love what they do, that they're standing up for it and they're starting to make changes for the better. They're starting to embrace independent artists. They're starting to they're listening to their listeners, and they're trying to make changes so that they make a product or a service that the listeners really like and want to, stay with. So I'm not sure where it will go. I know it has to change. It will have to adapt to the HD technology. I think that broadcast will have to basically join together with, an online presence. Because again, the time spent, again, will no longer be only with the radio. It will have to follow through with another type of platform, such as a website or online presence. But I see it strong. I see it growing. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was a very good and terrible piece of legislation all in one. The theory behind it, its intent was wonderful. The application of it was flawed. What happened is you had consolidation of ownership. You had major corporations such as Clear Channel basically taking over. The good thing is it saved a lot of stations that would have gone black, that were losing money, that didn't have the funds and the growth to adapt and put in new technologies such as, the systems that make it enable for, voice tracking and things like that. The bad thing is the impact that it had on the human element. All of a sudden you had corporate level programming, even though they'll all argue that no, they didn't. They did. Because they kind of set the bar of what the stations were supposed to be, and they did a lot of downsizing, so a lot of people lost their jobs. So when you have that kind of element, you see what's expected of you, and then you see all your coworkers being let go, then all of a sudden, even though it's not said out loud, it's like, wow, I better do what they're doing or else I'm going to lose my job. That's how, they say that there's the corporate programming, is program directors were kind of scared to stand up and take risks. Voice tracking enabled stations to all of a sudden go from a full 24-hour on-air staff to, you could get away with 3 jocks and a part-timer because you could record the breaks, and all of a sudden you didn't have to pay for 24 hours worth of, a body in the building. You could pay for an hour's worth of voice tracking. So it kind of affected the human element, and that was one of the biggest strengths of radio, the emotional attachment that listeners had with the on-air talent, calling in and making requests, Yeah, the feeling that it's live. DJs coming on and talking about what just happened on the air. It went away, and it really had a significant impact on that. And consolidation was a big reason for all of that to happen. You also had an impact on diversity. I worked for one of the major companies, and I know, our one station's library of 3,500 songs was taken down to 300. They would employ what they call spatial preemption within markets. Clear Channel would go in, and they would all of a sudden have a group of 10 stations within a market. So they would change formats so they wouldn't compete against themselves. They wouldn't have 2 country stations. They'd have a country station, and then they would have an AC station instead. And their argument was that they were helping diversity. But if you look at studies done by the Future Music Coalition, I did studies myself, you see that when you look at the actual songs that were played, the artists that were played across the called change of formats, you saw that there was mass duplication. So there really was a shrinking in, the songs and the artists that were being exposed on all of those stations, even though they argue that no, they had all these new formats that were being heard. When you actually look at the content, musical content on those formats, then you see that there was a dramatic impact.